a bit longer through till 8 o'clock if anybody wants to stay and chat to me about the campaign in West Midlands. So without further ado, I will hand us over to Layla. Welcome to the West Midlands, Layla.
Well, it's lovely to be with you, Jenny, and thank you, Jennifer, for organising this. And hello, everybody. Fantastic turnout. So my plan is to entertain you for an hour, and proportional to how much you have been entertained is how much we want you to give money. So now the next hour is on me to entertain you, and then what happens after that is on you. So just to let you know how this is going to work. I'm going to sort of give you a bit of a stream of consciousness for about 10 to 15 minutes, a little bit about my brief, but you know, it would be wrong to also not look at well, my brief is pretty wide, it's foreign affairs, so it's literally the whole world, but to also look a little bit about my role as the all-party group chair for coronavirus. We've been doing a lot of work recently on long COVID, to look a bit of the foreign affairs group and what we're doing and what we're sort of focusing on, but also to look at domestic politics and what now for the Lib Dems and what's really important. And just to give you a heads up, local campaigning really matters right now. So this will be a constant refrain, I'm sure, from all of the different speakers that you may have in your region coming up, but it is incredibly important. I hot to it to this meeting from one of my local party, where we're looking really carefully about what we can achieve in May, and it is potentially huge, but there is a big chasm between where we are now in terms of our campaigning strength and where we need to be to win seats in May, and we don't want to miss this opportunity, but I'll come back around to that point. So let's start with obviously the biggest issue of the day, and I should have started by saying, as I have done for most meetings that I've had this year, I hope you're well, I hope you're safe, I hope you're okay. I had a COVID scare this week. On Sunday, I got a fever and, you know, could barely move, aches, all the rest of it, and had the experience of having to get my first sort of ad hoc COVID test. I've been being tested with the ONS study quite by chance. But this was the first time I had to sort of go to a testing center, get tested. And actually, it was a pretty good experience, I have to say. You'll be pleased to know I'm negative. But I looked online for an appointment at 5 o'clock. I had the test by 6. And by 4 o'clock the next morning, I actually had it. So it does seem like very much after the fact, they finally sorted this out. And yes, the vaccine rollout is going well. They are expecting to hit their main target of vaccinating the top 4 million most vulnerable by Monday, although I think we're going to have to dig down a little deep into those numbers, because whilst they have reached, you know, in the 90% for a lot of those groups, there is a real concern that some of those people, particularly those from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, have a lot of vaccine hesitancy. And so what we've been focusing on in the all-party group is, you know, getting underneath the skin of what's happening in the news. So our hearing on Tuesday was all about the vaccines, and we had people there who could explain to us from AstraZeneca, a guy called Andrew Pollard, who's an Oxford professor who's leading the trials for the AstraZeneca vaccine, tell us that, you know, he thinks it's going very well. We got to question them about these different variants. We've been hearing a lot, of course, about the Kent one. We've now got one from Bristol. But there are a couple of others of variants of concern, the South African one, very obviously, but there's one more that I want to put on your radar, and that's the one from Brazil. The one from Brazil, the P1 variant, is particularly problematic because what happened, the P1 variant comes from an area in Brazil called Manaus. Manaus is in the Amazon and was very badly hit. Of course, we know that Brazil has a very autocrat state. Bolsonaro was very COVID skeptic at the beginning of this whole endeavor. Himself didn't want to really believe it was happening. And what we found in some parts of Brazil, including in this area, was that they had in the order of 75 to 80% of people get infected with COVID. Now that, you would think, would be enough to get herd immunity. Herd immunity can happen if you've got that level of infection, which we have never come close to here in the UK. However, the way they're describing it is that this P1 variant now dribbles around, because they love football, so they use a football analogy, it dribbles around the immune system and it's reinfecting people in droves, and they now have a second wave in Manaus. which is entirely unexpected. It is not what we would imagine would happen. And the only way this happens is if the mutation, which is now what they call a variant of concern, you might start to get used to these kinds of phrases, because there's lots of variants, but not all of them are concerning, but this is a variant of concern. They are now recognizing that mass reinfection can happen. And there's some preliminary data coming out from Italy suggesting that the vaccines we have may not work against it at all. I mean, we're not talking about a reduction in efficacy of, you know, from 90% to 60%, which is fine. Actually, we can deal with that. A lot of vaccines are around the 50-60% level, but the preliminary data is looking very bad for that P1 variant. Now, there are, of course, lots of ways around this. There's a lead time of 3 to 6 months to create new vaccines if we need to. The point I'm trying to make is that the road ahead is very bumpy. And whilst the government is spending a lot of time talking about its relative successes, actually we have to continue to remember and continue to say, in a way, in a tone that is respectful, that nevertheless we have one of the worst death rates per capita of the world, and also one of the economies that is performing the poorest. This government has not dealt with coronavirus well. But that is not, whilst that is empirically true, that is not the narrative that is being swallowed right now. And so we need to, as Lib Dems, I think, play to the fact that most people appreciate that. They understand that the deaths are not going very well. And to counter whenever we do talk positively about the vaccines, and I do, to say also, well, we have to remember that 113,000 people or more now have died. And then there's one final bit that we're really focusing in on. I asked a PMQ this week. Luckily, after years of not getting one, I was very lucky and got one. And I asked the Prime Minister about long COVID. Now, long COVID, there is an ONS study that suggests that long COVID could be as prevalent as 1 in 10 in the population. Now, that's 1 in 10 of people who tested positive, let alone the asymptomatic ones. We're also hearing that there's, and we've had evidence of this, of asymptomatic COVID in children, which then turns into long COVID later. This is also happening with adults too, but the whole idea that any of this is affecting children just isn't in the public domain, I think, in the public consciousness at all. And so I asked him about specifically the NHS and care workers who got COVID in that first wave and now find themselves, and one heartbreak. Someone muted me, sorry about that. So heartbreaking.
My fault, Layla, my apologies.
Don't worry, guys, I'm not going anywhere. Heartbreaking testimony from a doctor who genuinely doesn't think she's ever going to be able to walk again because of the long lasting effects of having had COVID in March and nearly a year later, finding herself unable to do it. So we really want to focus in on this as an all-party group. Because of the numbers that it's going to affect. So if you take that 1 in 10 figure, we've had about 4 million cases that we know of in this country. Of course, that's underreported because in the first wave, we weren't testing everyone, so we didn't know. And that puts the estimate, therefore, at people who at some point have suffered with long COVID or likely still suffer with long COVID is about 400,000 people in this country. That's about the same number of people, by the way, that suffer from arthritis. So if anyone here knows someone or themselves suffers from arthritis, that's the same scale. And it's pretty scary, and it's going to have big, medium and long-term effects on the country. So that's this country. I've also, in the context of that, been raising the issue of vaccine equity across the world. And this first came to light, actually personally, because I had friends, many of you may know, I'm half Palestinian, and many of you may know that I've got family back home, and they were saying they themselves were getting vaccinated because they actually live near Jerusalem, but they had friends who were living in occupied territories that weren't. And I was really concerned by this. I was talking to the Palestinian ambassador about it, especially in Gaza. There is no ITU. You know, people talk about, well, we've got ITUs full of people. There are places in the world that don't have ITUs at all. And so those people just pass away. And what the Palestinians were asking for was just enough for their healthcare workers and 85 pluses to be vaccinated. And then the rest can come from the international effort to vaccinate, which is called Gavi, which is part run by the Gates Foundation and the WHO. But the government were saying that we need to wait until we've done more. And this raised the issue in my mind that whilst, we are approaching 50 million vaccinations done, there was that spat between us and the European Union. And I thought it was grotesque, to be perfectly honest with you, because while the UK and the EU were fighting over tens of millions of doses, in Africa, in that same week, no more than 55 people out of a population of 1.3 billion had been vaccinated at all in the entire continent. And that to me is an enormous failure across the world to work together. And it's a moment where we as Lib Dems, I think, should be standing up loudly and proudly saying, you solve the world's problems by working together. No one is safe until everyone is safe. And this is not a time to be having a me first attitude, which is what the WHO was calling for us to abandon, and instead work with other people. And through that, and I think it would be wrong to not mention Europe. It still matters, especially right now for businesses in particular. The fallout from the trade deal is obviously front and center of many people's minds. It's not just in Ireland that they're seeing problems. You'll have seen Alistair Carmichael has been absolutely amazing on this when it comes to fisheries, Tim when it comes to farming, and every single part of society is now going to be affected by the fallout from this deal. And I got asked, I think they were trying to skewer me, but they didn't manage it. I got asked, you said sign up to the EU vaccines program back in whenever it was over the summer. Don't you regret saying that now? And I said, no, I absolutely think that the right thing to have done was to work closely with our EU allies on this. I mean, hell, we've got clearly good expertise at procurement. Maybe it would have been different from the EU's point of view as well, had we been involved. This is a great example of how we would have added to the sum of the parts of that entire endeavour and maybe avoided that very same spat. But I do not use that as an excuse to say that Brexit was a good idea. Brexit was a terrible idea because we need to work together. And so to the future, when we're looking at how we talk about Britain on the world stage, and you'll have seen we're doing a lot of stuff around the Uyghurs and Russia, and I'm very happy to come back to these points in questions later perhaps, but there are cornerstones of how I want to approach this as a party. And one is global solutions to global problems, whether it be the pandemic, whether it be climate change, whatever it is. And the second is around human rights and social justice. And if you take those pillars together, then actually that underpins all of our party's policy that we will be pushing out. And if you're ever wondering what's our party's policy on that, apply those tests, and very likely you will hit on what it is that we are saying if you haven't seen it already, because those are my tests for how we approach something. And then very finally, before I'll pass it back to Jenny, we can start having a bit of a chin wag. I've got my little glass of wine. It was bigger now. There we go, it's smaller. I'm not Jackie Weaver, by the way. I just did that to make you giggle. Was the state of the party and what we need to do. So we have an enormous challenge. The Tories are desperate to stop us campaigning. They're absolutely desperate, and Labour are just as complicit. We have, I believe today or yesterday, actually now spoken to the Police Chiefs Council about the application of the guidance of the law that as the minister sees it, and they don't see it in the same way as the minister. We do think that we could challenge them in court if people, particularly councillors, sitting councillors at any level, who want to communicate with their residents, should feel absolutely no hesitation in doing that, because it is absolutely the right thing to do. But we now appreciate how scared the Tories are, because they didn't make those caveats. They didn't say that, which I think is reasonable. In Oxford, West and Abingdon, when we went into lockdown, we did stop our delivery networks. There were some people who were incredibly keen and went out anyway, but we didn't ask them to do it. We changed our tabloid. We didn't put that out. And we're doing a lot more through Royal Mail. And just to remind you, tonight's evening is about money. And one of the important things that money can do in this situation is ask Royal Mail to deliver things that we may not otherwise be able to get round the Tories wanting us to not campaign. And why do the Tories not want us to campaign? Because they know that they are in a pickle. Brexit may be done, but my challenge to Boris Johnson is to make it work. And he's struggling. The pandemic may have elements that are going well, but equally think of all the people who have now passed away. How many people now don't know someone who has been affected by this in some way? It's very few people, and that's on the government. So they know they're going to have a tough time this May, and they want to stop us campaigning. So my call to action to all of you is phone every phone number you can get your hands on. It's lovely coming to talks like this, and it's actually really nice because people are just so delighted to hear someone who's not their family on the phone or someone they've been talking to throughout. You'd be really surprised if you haven't done phone calls in the last few weeks. You will get the warmest reception ever. And if you've never done it before, believe me, this is the best time to start. And you start by saying, I'm from the local Lib Dems. I just wanted to check, are you all right? Is there anything you need? And then you move on to the gentle conversation. Have you heard about our brilliant candidate, Jenny? Let me tell you about Jenny. Let me tell you about whoever it is that you are talking about. And you very gently ease them into that conversation. And you may at this point get that voting intention. More likely than not, they haven't even realized elections are happening. It's a great excuse to call EU voters. They can vote in these elections for the last time. And so it's really important that they are able to. So all of these little actions can make a huge difference. And when people are looking at our poll ratings, I mean, it's hard to see the Greens above us right now, but that can be turned around if we show people how we're relevant. And one of the ways we show people how we're relevant is we win elections by getting more councillors, by turning the tide in a number of councils. We're hoping to take over from the Tories the county council in my area. And that will make a difference to people. And then people will see what it means to have Lib Dems in charge. And it's the way we counter a lot of the negative things that will be put out about us in the press, not least by the Tories, who are desperate for us not to do well, because they know that the vast majority of votes that will come our way at this point will probably come from them. So I will end on that note and pass back to Jenny.
Thanks so much, Layla. Really great to have your sort of insights into everything that's going on at the moment, which is clearly a lot. So we're going to move on to questions now. I'm going to start with Ian Garrett in a moment. So be ready, Ian. Can I just ask, when people are asking questions, let's try and keep this quite concise and to the point, please. We don't have lots of time, and people really want to hear from Layla. So Ian, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, I'm a local secondary school teacher. So obviously one of the concerns, both for me professionally, but for loads of people on this call at one level or another, is the situation with exams at the moment. And so far there seems to have been very, very little direction on how exam grades are going to be awarded this year and all that goes with that. So A, what do you think is going to happen? But B, what's our response as a party and our guidance as a party, if you like, to the current situation and how we think grades would best be granted this year?
Thanks, Ian. So issue close to my heart. I'm still a member of the Chartered College of Teaching, and I wear my teacher hat very often first before being a politician. So I completely understand where you're coming from, because actually, as you know, and others may also know, by the time you get to Easter, which is not that far away, you usually should have finished the syllabus by then, and you should, from Easter onwards, be able to start. It's always an aspiration, I appreciate that, but you should at that point be starting to do past papers, and you start really focusing in on helping kids get ready mentally for the ordeal, frankly, that is our exam system. And it is an ordeal. I think there will be some things that will come out of this, I hope, in the future that make people think. I pulled together, by the way, a commission of different groups, including people like the NEU, Make UK, Warwick University, and many others over the last few years. And we released a report called the Future Education Commission. And in there, we had a conversation around assessments. And the main thing that fell out of it, which I think is a conversation we need to have as a country, is what exactly is the point of some of these assessments? And the one I think that's the most controversial, which is not party policy, but I think is worth throwing out there, is what exactly is the point of GCSEs when we now have all students having to stay in educational training until 18? And so there's some interesting questions that are coming out of that. The answer specifically to your question is what's going to happen? How long is a piece of string? Ofqual have had their consultation. We are hopeful that they will release what's happening very, very soon. We know that in Wales, they have got further ahead. And it's worth reminding ourselves that Kirsty Williams, Lib Dem Education Secretary in Wales, is now saying, it's teacher assessed grades. And by doing that earlier rather than later, and I used to be a head of department and a head of year, actually really good high quality moderation, doing teacher assessed grades it's not just a teacher giving each child a mark and hoping for the best. You actually have a lot of work that has to go in behind the scenes if you're going to do that properly. And if that is what they're going to do, my worry is unless they actually release it bluntly next week, then you are going to struggle to get kids prepared for what they need to do post Easter to make sure they maximize the grades that they're going to get. There's also a whole question about how are they going to tackle the fact that some kids are now potentially 2 terms, if not an entire year, behind where they would have been. And there's people like the Resolution Foundation and others who have pointed out that of course it's disproportionately the kids who are coming from the poorest backgrounds who are likely to be the ones who have not had access to the laptops, who haven't been able to have that sort of quiet space in the home. More likely they're the ones sharing bedrooms, sharing spaces with parents who are working. Both parents have to work to make the rent, you name it. They are the ones, and it's disadvantage after disadvantage after disadvantage that they have faced. And if they haven't had the catch up by the time you get to the exams, then what do you do for them? And there's a whole debate right now going on about, well, do you allow them to sort of retake and essentially encourage swathes of students to take an extra year at this stage? Or do you do something to the exams to try and account for the differences, often in the same school, of how far children have come because of their home environments? And so it's incredibly complex, and I think it's going to be somewhere around all of those things. But one thing I've called for is a 10-year plan for young people right now. And if you look at crisis zones across the world, again, I'm a big fan of the Chartered College of Teaching. They did a study right at the beginning of the pandemic about what we can learn from places like Syria, but also New Zealand, who you'll remember had the earthquake in Christchurch that basically shut down schools in one part of New Zealand. And so you had a perfect experiment, same education system, but one part shut down, one part not. What happens to the children? The reassuring bit is that actually younger children, because they have longer to catch up, tend to do okay over time. After 2 or 3 years, they catch up. And when you do a longitudinal study of those children, they're okay. The ones I really worry about, and that's why I think we need a long-term plan for this, are the ones who are doing their A-levels and are planning that next step. And disproportionately, those young people will end up carrying the burden of what's happened for the rest of their lives in terms of earnings. So I know that's a very roundabout way of saying I don't know what's going to happen yet, but these are, I think, the big issues that we need to be focusing on as a party and society.
Thanks, Layla. That's really helpful. Can I ask Izzy Knowles to speak next, and then I'll speak to Roger Harmer. Okay, so Izzy next.
Hi, Layla, Jackie.
Hiya.
Welcome to the West Midlands. My question is, what is the roadmap for rejoining the EU?
Excellent question, and one actually for the party. So whilst I am spokesperson for foreign affairs, and you'd imagine I am closely involved and will be closely involved in helping the party to shepherd our way through this, my own view right now is that it's too early to say. We know that we are a party of rejoin. I just want to make that absolutely clear. Yes, we are a party of rejoin, but party's policy is not yet, which I think is fair. And so actually the way you put the question, I think, is perfect, because we are going to have to come up with a roadmap. But there are a lot of unknowns right now. And one that I do think is fair for us to wait for is what is going to be the politics post-pandemic. Where are we going to land? And I don't just mean in this country, I mean globally after this pandemic. There is almost a twin speed of economies right now. Those who managed to get on top of it early and that may lead us on to further questions down the line about, you know, the big geopolitical shifts that we're seeing in the world right now, and China and the relationship between China and the US and then the EU and all the rest of it. That is all going to play. And so my view is that right now we need to do something that we as Lib Dems are really bad at. We need to show people what the problem is before we go to a solution. Rejoin is a solution to a problem that, bluntly, I don't think enough of the British public right now appreciate as a problem. And it is going to be a problem. It's going to continue to be a problem. And my challenge to Boris Johnson is very simply, he wanted to get Brexit done. Now he has to make Brexit work. He has to show everyone that it can work. And we know it can't. We know that this deal cannot work. And then anything from there will come, whether it's joining the customs union and single market, which I'm sure will feature along the way, although there are big debates to be had, even as a party, about if that's the position we want. Rule takers, rule makers, actually, should we not just wait and then go the whole hog when the time comes? Or do we positively advocate for a sort of a middle ground? But if you talk to anyone from Norway, that has a lot of its own problems. So I think as a party, that roadmap is something we are going to have to deep dive into. There is a motion at conference, for those who are interested in this, that I'm proposing, where we essentially instruct the party to come up with this roadmap. And I think it's really important in our best tradition that we have that discussion. But if someone in the street asks you, you know, do you guys want to rejoin the European Union? You can say loud and proud, well, yes, we do. But we also appreciate that we need to focus on what's really happening right now in front of our nose. It's the pandemic. It's, you know, holding Boris Johnson's feet to the fire. He got Brexit done, but we want to know it's going to work for people. And we are going to develop the next steps for if, you can say if when you know it's when, Brexit starts to properly unravel. And I think this is going to start to hit in about 2 or 3 years' time. We come out of this pandemic, and this is just a prediction, but you come out of this pandemic as best you can, although we're probably going to live with this for some time, folks. I'm sorry to say it's likely that this time next year, it will still be with us in some form. But we are going to start to see that economies that are in the European Union are going to do better, and ours is going to continue to, it'll go up, but there'll be all sorts of excuses for why it's not doing as well as it would have done before. And at that point, Brexit starts to reveal itself just in time for the next general election, which gives us time to develop that roadmap, but being very clear about who we are and what we want now. I hope that answers your question.
That's great. Thanks, Layla. So we'll take Roger Harmer next, and then Rita Baker, if you want to ask a question after that. So Roger.
Hey, hi Layla. Thank you very much for taking part this evening. My question is about China and the Uyghur situation. I guess none of us are particularly surprised by the horrific news that's come out of there in the last week or so, but it is horrific. But my question is, how do we relate with China when so much of our trade is with China? I'm watching you on a laptop made in China. So how do we put pressure on them, given those economic pressures?
Thank you, Roger. This is a huge question, and actually one that I want to make sure that as a party we get right. I'll start by saying, I don't think that having a policy that absolutely cuts off any communication or diplomacy with countries, even if they are doing something horrific like that, is the right approach. You need to be able to influence people, be very robust about who you are and what your values are. And I think I'll come to how we can assert that in a moment. But a country as big as China, to suggest that we're just going to stop trading with them completely in all of its forms, I just don't think that's very likely. It is a real shame that at the moment that Britain decides it wants to have a bust up with China, that it's come out of the European Union, is the first point I'll make. Giants like China listen to other giants. they really don't care very much what the UK thinks in of itself. They care about us because we have the G7 presidency, we've got a close relationship with America. It means that we are now going to have to find ways to assert ourselves on that global stage that is even more important to do than when we were part of that EU bloc. And actually influencing that EU bloc continues to be incredibly important too. So we cannot divorce ourselves from that. And the biggest influence that we can have on China is not alone, but with others. And I think that's very, very important to start with. And it's a direct counter to actually a lot of the very same parliamentarians that I'm working with right now to get this stuff through Parliament. I mean, Ian Duncan Smith and I are in regular contact over this issue. Absolutely not someone who I ever thought I would be working this closely with. But over this issue, we are absolutely of one voice against the government, trying to influence our trade policy, trying to allow determinations of genocide in our courts, because of course China, by virtue of its position on the United Nations, has a veto in stopping such things getting to the International Criminal Court. So there is a problem with the international rule-based order, and I think it's right that we try and circumvent it in that way. But actually, the real answer lies in cooperation internationally. In terms of what can we do now, you know, that's going to take some time. Biden, I think, is very, very sound on this. It's well worth looking at noises coming out from his administration. Actually, this is an area where they agreed with the Trump administration. They did want to get harder with America. They, of course, have other interests, Silicon Valley and others. But nevertheless, they also have a much stronger commitment to human rights than the Trump administration. And I think there's going to be a lot that we can do with America on this. But what can we do domestically? Well, I spoke about the trade bill. There is a chance that the so-called genocide amendment, so this is the court's determination, could happen. It may come back to the Commons. It was narrowly defeated. And given that Boris Johnson has a majority of 80, the fact that we ran the government so close shows that there is real legs in this. It could well come back. But the other thing is I would encourage you all as consumers to vote with your wallets. And you mentioned that you have a Chinese computer. All I would encourage you to do is, you know, is there another brand that would do just as well? Particularly if said computer is linked in any way with Uyghur labor camps. And you can look online for reputable sources funded by the Foreign Office and others who have looked into these supply chains. And you will be surprised to find that it's big companies like Apple, and I say this as an Apple lover, it's big companies like Apple, it's big companies like Nike, Adidas, by the way, did have and the cotton industry in particular, a huge percentage of the cotton industry runs through Xinjiang, and this is of particular concern. But Adidas, in response to this, changed their supply chains so that it no longer includes any suggestion of forced labor. So there are lists out there. I quite often post them on my Twitter, but just have a Google and you will find them. And if there is something concrete that you want to do to help the Uyghur people, it is that. Look at what companies you buy from and consider, is there an alternative? And that actually, done en masse, could start to influence it.
Thanks, Layla. That's really useful to have some proper good tips that we can actually use and go and apply. So that's really helpful. Thank you. So I'll ask Rita Baker if you want to speak, and then I'll go to David Nichol. So Rita, I think I saw you on.
I've got two questions, but I'll just ask the first one, which is a suggestion as much as a question. Going back to the question of education, my great fear is that Boris Johnson will try to select some education agency who will pay a load of crap teachers, who will work for the money to go and help out children after this crisis. I reckon there are a lot of retired teachers among the Lib Dems and other parties like me who would give their time cheerfully, freely. Of course it would need coordinating and you'd have to have the normal checks and stuff, but I'm sure there's enough volunteer will out there. Why don't we, as a body, all of us at the same time across the body, get that idea out there in the press, on the local radio, as, you know, we're offering a potential solution, we the Lib Dems.
I love that idea, Rita. I do. And before I had the Foreign Affairs brief, I had the education brief. And we put forward at that point, early on in the pandemic, a 5-point plan that included having a mass volunteer force of retired teachers and also supply teachers, many of whom aren't working right now, who could have been doing some of this catch-up stuff now and could be working with individual children now. Now, of course, you're right. They're finally waking up to the fact that it should be catch-up. Well, if you catch people while they're falling, you don't have to then push them back up again afterwards. And as many of you will know, who have kids, it's much harder to do that once they've had a period where they got used to another way of working. So as ever, we regret that they didn't take on the excellent suggestion, if I do say so myself, months ago. But you're right, Rita, and I think that's lovely. And you'll remember that early on in the pandemic, we had a volunteer force of Lib Dems who were going out and helping in the community. And I presume that you're a member of our education association, and if you're not, I know that there are members in the West Mids who can help you out. But actually, I wonder if it's worth us coordinating with them on such an initiative, because disproportionately teachers will be a member of the Lib Dem Education Association. So maybe that's the way to do it.
Thank you. And do I have time for a second question, or?
I've got a very long list of people waiting, if you don't mind, Rita.
Okay, fine.
I'll give somebody else a chance. Thank you. Thanks very much. That's really good comments. Thank you. So I'm going to go to David Nichol next, and then I've got David Craddock after that, please. David Nichol.
Layla, it's lovely to talk to you. I realised when the pandemic started, we were both meant to be at an event that Jenny organised at Lib Dem Spring Conference. So we've never actually met face to face. So the definition of when we've got through this is when we meet for a drink.
Exactly.
At Lib Dem. So Jenny, I have chipped in some cash. My question is to do with this, which is the Conservatives are going to focus on the vaccine success, but actually I'd argue that track, trace and isolate and support is actually the most important thing. It's been an abject disaster. We're spending over £2.5 million a day on external consultants on track and trace. So what can we do? There have to be carrots as well as sticks to encourage people to isolate. What can we do as Lib Dems to highlight on this? One of the things I'm doing is I've done an FOI on all the district councils in Worcestershire to try and get their data, because I think, so if anyone's got problems with getting access to the £500 to help isolate, I'm really interested to know, but just your thoughts on that area.
No, thank you, David. So as you can imagine, the all-party group, I mean, this is why we constituted. We started back in the summer, and the point was, in the absence of an interim public inquiry or any kind of transparency from the government at that point about what they were doing in terms of their strategy, we wanted to understand what was happening in the background, what learning we can learn from other countries that have got on top of this virus. I will come back to test, trace, isolate in a moment, because that is one of the absolute first things that they did. But also what else there might be, and then to kind of package that together into something we could sell to government. And so in December, and if you're, APPG coronavirus, I think someone put the link in the chat, but do have a look. And we put a interim report that also linked to our, what we call a COVID secure UK exit strategy from this virus. And it comes in 3 parts. Part 1 is where we are now. When the R rate gets above 1, the first thing you have to do is to lock down, have a national lockdown and get it below 1. They've done that 3 times now. And each time it then goes the wrong way, because there's 2 other steps. Step 2 is suppress, and I'll come back to that step in a moment, but that is characterized by our continuing to go down, by suppression of the virus. And that's primarily done in 2 forms, because actually test, trace, isolate is very difficult to do. Cutting those trains of transmission is very difficult to do when you have lots and lots of prevalence in the community. So you have to get it down below a certain level before test, trace, isolate really works. But when it really works well. And then step 3 is eliminate, which is the vaccines. And the problem with this government is, if you think about that, 3 steps. Step 1, lockdown. Step 2, suppress. Step 3, vaccine. 1, they know how to do, finally. Too late, often, but finally. Step 3 is going okay. what about step 2? Every single time they have failed at step 2. And that is characterized by test, trace, isolate, and isolate is the important bit. So something ridiculous like less than half of people who are asked to isolate are able to for that time. And I say are able to because I maintain that most people understand how difficult this is. Very few people are so COVID skeptic that they don't understand the consequences of them leaving the house. But they often can't stay at home for that period of time because they just don't have the money. And if you look at countries that have gotten on top of this, they offer those people who need to isolate money, not just £500 and not just those who, quote, need it the most, because how do you define that? They actually open it up pretty widely. We could have done this, the £22 billion that is earmarked for test, trace, isolate, only as a proportion, think about this, 22 billion, 1.3 billion of that, so a tiny proportion is meant to go towards the money needed to isolate. So test and trace, lots of money to be made. We've seen all the public procurement stuff. I'm part of a Good Law Project suit against the government to get them to publish their contracts. Dido Harding, you know, not at all qualified to be doing the job that she's doing. Huge amounts of money, billions of pounds being spent on test and trace, but not anywhere near enough on the isolate. And carrots, according to behavioural scientists who have given us that evidence, work much better than sticks. So it's all very well saying that you're going to imprison people for 10 years or fine them huge amounts of money. Actually, the best thing you can do to get people to do it, frankly, is to reward them. And if you can't do that, if they can't do that for whatever reason, they live in houses of multiple occupancy, you give them hotel rooms, you give them the support that they need. That is what Taiwan have been doing. It's what they're now doing in New York. New York had a system where people struggled to isolate, and now they have over 90% compliance with isolation because they have done those things. So every step of the way we have advocated for this. That plus border controls is what characterizes suppression in our report. And then once you keep suppressing it, getting it low, you then do elimination at the same time. And that's how you get to a COVID secure UK. The government slowly, kicking and screaming, has been adopting what we've said as they've gone through. It's no surprise. Now, I would love to think it's all because of our report. Well, of course it isn't. It's because we synthesized what was happening across the world, put it all in one place. And they are slowly realizing that we were right by looking at other countries. So I can predict that the next thing that is going to happen is that they are going to start taking that isolation bit a bit more seriously, not just £500 payments, but possibly more. But I think they're also putting a lot of stock in the vaccination program being so widespread that it's going to start to depress transmission. The evidence is it will. The problem we have is we don't know what effect variants of concern is going to have on that program. And so you can't expect that vaccination is going to be a silver bullet. You have to do both.
Couldn't agree more.
Glad you agree.
Thanks, Layla. Thanks, David. I'm going to ask David Craddock next, and then I think we'll have time for a question from John Kelly after that.
Hi, Layla. It's so good to see you, I have to say, and you make some really good points around a whole load of subjects. And you just reminded me about what a brilliant communicator you are. But what worries me at the moment is that we're not getting much media coverage, as far as I can tell, as Lib Dems, and I noticed in a poll the other day, I think the Greens are polling at the same percentage as us, at 6%. So what can we do as a party to get more media coverage? And how can we get you back on the telly more, please?
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I think part of it, in terms of me personally, certainly since leadership election, I have decided to take a little bit of a step back just to have a bit of a breather. But also, I have also found that since the summer, there is not that much opportunity right now. It's been really tough to get into the news. And one of the reasons for that is partly the situation. People want to hear what the answer is now. I think people are really fed up, and I hope everyone's all right, because I keep hearing from friends and family who are not okay in this lockdown. Like, this one is much, much harder than the other two. I think it's duration. I think it's third time blues. I think it's the weather. And those who have kids, certainly, the third round of homeschooling is really not going down terribly well, particularly with the young kids. I heard of my friend's son who's 8. His parents reckon that he's a bit depressed, and is waking up crying and not sleeping at night. And he's such a sociable boy that normally he's sort of happy-go-lucky, seeing lots of his friends, and he's just not. And it's really, really difficult. So that people want to know what the answer is, and the answer unfortunately doesn't come from us. The answer is going to come from Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock, and people love shooting them down right now, but actually all that is focusing your attention on them all the time. So I think that's part of it, and I think that partly explains, people are saying, oh, Labour should be doing better. I think they're also suffering from the same thing. I think that effect is playing. But I think there's also something else, and I think there is a challenge that needs to be put to the party, which is we have to raise our sights and give people something positive and something hopeful to think about. And I'm not sure we're doing enough of that. And as you rightly point out, the Greens are level pegging, but actually there's a poll that came out today that shows they're ahead. We're on 6, they're on 8. And if you saw their last party political broadcast, I think they might have captured that mood a bit better. They have, decided to really play into their strengths, play into what they're known for. And despite the fact that actually they've got 2 co-leaders, I would argue that many people don't know who they are. So this is absolutely not a criticism of Ed whatsoever. It is a criticism of us collectively as a party getting ourselves tied up in knots with weeds. And if I hear another person say, oh, we need more policy on X, or we need another campaign on Y, that's not the problem. It's how we're communicating it. And it's the mood with which we're saying it. And I think people are sick and tired of parliamentarians and politicians taking shots at each other. They don't want to hear negativity right now. They want to hear positivity. And I suppose my question to the party as a whole is, how do we tap into that? So yes, we need to hold the Tories' feet to the fire and everything that I've been doing, but how do we also offer a vision of hope? And I don't have the full answer to this, bluntly, because I think it's something that we do need to come up with as a party. And I don't think the party, all it's good for is coming up with very detailed policy. I think as a party that we can also offer those visions of hope, and Jenny will be doing that in her campaigns, I'm sure, and in our local elections. And this is why, bringing it right back to why we're here in the first place, this is why these local elections are so important, because it's our chance to offer that vision of hope at a very local level to people who we can then encourage to vote for us. But I would encourage campaigners writing their next focus that is going to be delivered as soon as we're able, or perhaps going out by Royal Mail. Have a look at the balance of the stories that you're putting out there. Are they just attacking your opponents, or what is your vision of hope? What is the alternative positive vision that we have as Liberal Democrats in our local area that we can offer to residents as a credible, compassionate alternative to what's happening right now? And if you haven't got any of those, then I would encourage you, put one in. You'd be surprised.
Oh, thanks, Layla. You've got my vote, and I've just made a donation into Jenny's campaign. So, and good luck to Jenny.
Right. Good luck.
Thank you very much. I mean, just to say that, because I'm involved in a working group at the moment, and the message that I keep on getting, or trying to get across, is that we've actually got great policies in the Lib Dems, but we need to talk about them more to voters rather than to ourselves. That's my plea.
Exactly. So get on the phone.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, we need to wrap up very shortly, but I'll just give John a very quick minute to ask his question, and Layla a very quick minute to respond before we wrap it up. John.
Well, one of the great policies that we have is that we believe in federalism for the whole of the UK. And if there's one thing that's become very clear during the pandemic, Germany has handled it so much better than us, and it's a truly federal country where 50% of public expenditure is actually made locally and regionally, whereas in this country, the government keeps 75% of the money. Does this give us an opportunity now to really push federalism as the answer to many of the country's problems?
Yeah. I mean, very, very quick answer is absolutely yes. And it's one of our USPs. And I spoke about the Greens really leaning into what they're already known for. If you think about Lib Dems, what are we really known for? And I would argue that one of them is internationalism, and it's in the form of Brexit, or it's in the form of, you know, when Paddy spoke about Hong Kong, or when Charlie spoke about Iraq, you know, actually very often when we get cut through, it's on those international levels. But also, what's the other one? We are a party of local government, and people joke at us that all we talk about is potholes, and there are, you know, Twitter memes about Lib Dem councillors pointing at potholes, and I'm proud of those. I'm absolutely proud of those, because there is a direct line between how we see the world that links that localism to that internationalism, and it bluntly is that you solve your problems by working with other people. And that works as much at a local level, where we try to bring communities together, where we try and involve everybody. That's why we care about equality. That's why we care about PR. We believe in working together. It works at a national level. It's why we don't want Scotland to leave the Union, because that would be us not working as closely together. It's why we wanted to be part of the European Union. It's why we care about the United Nations and the WHO and everything else. It's a thread that runs through all of our policy, and we really need to lean into that localism. And you rightly point out, John, those countries that have leaned into that in the past have done much better in a time of crisis, and that is unsurprising as Liberals, is it not? Because we believe in the power of the individual to come up with solutions that are much better than any state could come up with. And by those individuals working together at a local and regional level, then you're going to get much better answers to the big questions than you are by devolving that away from where that policy is going to meet the ground. So in the end, it's all about potholes.
Oh, lovely way to conclude, all about potholes. Thank you so much for your time this evening, Layla. I think everyone's, you know, it's always so inspiring to listen to you and hear everything you have to say. So really, really grateful for your support. So I'll let you go to your next meet. I don't know if you want to just say a couple of more words. Apart from
I'll say two things only. One, those who, yes, well done, Michael. Top class. Those who have not donated yet, be like Michael and everyone else who has donated. So please do that. And also just to say an enormous thank you to you, Jenny, and thank you, Jennifer, for organising it, and thank you all for coming. It's been a real pleasure. So enjoy the rest of your evening and your pizza and your wine and everything else. But thank you so much, and take care and stay safe.
Thank you so much, Layla. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Layla.
Thank you. So I'm happy to hang around for a bit longer if people want to ask me questions or have a general chat, share your views. We can always talk about some of the questions that people didn't manage to ask, unfortunately, if anybody wants to, or you can feel free to disappear off, whatever you prefer.